a legendary historical story to listen to before you sleep. History can change with a single choice. The shouts of the crowd can free one man from chains while another walks toward the cross. Barabbas. A man about whom little is known, yet whose name has been etched forever into humanity's memory. From the darkness of Roman dungeons to the sunny streets of Jerusalem, a life story filled with crime, faith, betrayal, and redemption. This is the tale of a sinner, forgiven in the shadow of innocence. But who was Barabbas, really? The world that made Barabbas. To understand Barabbas, one must first understand the city that held him. Jerusalem in the early 1st century was a city of contradictions, holy yet oppressed, proud yet fearful, a place where temple priests and zealot rebels eyed each other with suspicion. Rome had annexed Judea in 6 AD, installing procurators who answered directly to the emperor. These governors were pragmatic, often brutal, wielding crucifixion as a public warning to those who dared disturb imperial order. The Jewish people lived under 2 laws, the Torah and Caesar's decrees. To many, this was an unbearable insult to their identity. Revolts had flared up repeatedly. Judas the Galilean's tax resistance movement in AD 6, sporadic attacks on Roman patrols, and whispered prophecies about a coming Messiah who would break the yoke of foreign rule. It was in this furnace of occupation and expectation that Barabbas' story took shape. The prisoner's reputation. The Gospels call him a lestes, often translated robber, but in the language of the time it meant something closer to insurgent or bandit rebel. Mark 15:7 gives us the sharpest clue. Barabbas was imprisoned with the rebels, who had committed murder in the uprising. This was not petty theft. It was political violence. He was likely part of a militant cell that had ambushed Roman or pro-Roman targets. Perhaps he had taken part in an urban riot during one of the tense feast days, when passions ran high. Some scholars believe Barabbas may have been linked to the Sicarii, dagger-wielding zealots who moved through crowds during festivals, striking down collaborators before melting back into the throng. Others imagine him as a local strongman, part revolutionary, part outlaw, someone feared by the Roman authorities but romanticized by the oppressed. In any case, by the time Passover arrived that year, Barabbas was a man condemned. In Roman eyes, his fate was sealed: crucifixion, the most shameful and agonizing death, reserved for rebels and slaves. Passover and the prisoner's choice. Here the gospel narratives converge on a strange custom that during Passover, the Roman governor would release one prisoner chosen by the people. No Roman law records this directly, but historians have noted parallels. Roman governors sometimes granted amnesties during festivals to appease local populations. Pilate, aware of the volatile atmosphere, may have used such a practice to diffuse unrest. That year, the choice presented was startling. On one side, Jesus of Nazareth, accused of blasphemy by the temple authorities, but to Pilate merely an odd, enigmatic preacher. On the other, Barabbas, a known insurrectionist, blood on his hands, a man who had directly challenged Roman power. One represented a spiritual kingdom, the other a tangible if violent resistance. The crowd, stirred by unknown hands, chose Barabbas. The moment of release. One can imagine the scene in the Antonia fortress courtyard. The chains clinked as a soldier unlocked them. Barabbas, perhaps expecting to be led to the place of the skull that morning, instead found the sun on his face as the guards pushed him toward freedom. Behind him, another man, silent, beaten, crowned with thorns, was taken in his place. The irony would echo for centuries, the innocent condemned. Did Barabbas understand what had happened? Did he know the name of the man who now walked toward the cross meant for him? The Gospels do not say. His story ends there, a door swinging open onto speculation. Historical shadows. Outside the biblical text, history gives us nothing more of Barabbas. No Roman record, no Jewish chronicle mentions him. This absence is itself telling. Barabbas was not a leader whose deeds shaped policy. He was one of countless men caught in the grinding wheel of occupation and resistance. His survival, the result of political theater at a festival, was a quirk of history. And yet, this obscure man became a symbol so potent that for 2,000 years his name has been spoken alongside that of Jesus. In the contrast between the two, the violent rebel and the suffering servant, theologians, artists, and storytellers have found an inexhaustible well of meaning, the trial and the choice. The dust of Jerusalem still hung in the air as dawn broke over the city. Narrow streets echoed with the sounds of early footsteps, traders setting up their stalls, Roman soldiers changing watch, and murmured conversations about the strange events unfolding at the governor's palace. Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect, had risen early that morning. His role in Judea was a thankless one, to maintain peace in a land simmering with religious passion and political unrest. The Jewish Passover was a dangerous time for him. Thousands of pilgrims poured into the city, and nationalist fervor often boiled just beneath the surface. Rome demanded order, and Pilate knew that a single spark could ignite rebellion. It was under these tense circumstances that two men stood before him, Jesus of Nazareth and Barabbas. Two prisoners, two stories. Barabbas was already infamous. The Gospels describe him as a man notorious, Matthew 27:16, guilty of insurrection, Mark 15:7, Luke 23:19, and a murderer. The word used lestes in Greek could mean bandit, but in the political climate of Judea, it often referred to those engaged in armed rebellion against Rome. Barabbas was not just a criminal, he was a political prisoner, perhaps even a zealot, part of an underground movement that dreamed of a free Judea. Jesus, by contrast, was accused of stirring up the people, but not through violence. His followers called him the Messiah, the Anointed One. His miracles and teachings had drawn huge crowds. For the temple authorities, however, his message threatened their control. He had openly criticized hypocrisy among the religious elite, overturned the tables of the money changers, and spoken of a kingdom not of this world. To Pilate, these two prisoners represented two different kinds of danger. Barabbas, the violent revolutionary whose followers could be crushed with Roman force, and Jesus, the spiritual leader whose influence was subtle but far-reaching, more difficult to suppress. The Passover custom. There was an unusual custom during the Passover festival. The Roman governor would release one prisoner chosen by the people. This was likely a gesture to appease the local population, a symbolic act to show Rome's mercy. Whether the custom was genuine policy or an ad hoc tradition is still debated by historians, but in the Gospel accounts, Pilate saw in it an opportunity. He could release Jesus without appearing to defy the religious leaders. By offering the crowd a choice between a known insurrectionist and the teacher from Galilee, Pilate must have thought the decision was obvious. Who would choose a murderer over a healer? But Pilate underestimated the forces at work. The crowd gathers. The courtyard outside the praetorium filled with people. Some had come out of curiosity. Others had been stirred by whispers in the streets. The chief priests and elders, according to the Gospel accounts, had already influenced many in the crowd to demand Barabbas's release. Pilate stood before them, the two prisoners at his side. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" he asked. A murmur rippled through the assembly, then rose into a chant. "Barabbas!" The prefect frowned. "What shall I do, then, with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" The answer came back, louder, more unified. "Crucify him!" Pilate's dilemma. The scene was tense, chaotic. Pilate was a man used to issuing commands. not negotiating with a restless crowd. Yet here he was, caught between political necessity and personal conscience. The Gospel of Matthew records that Pilate's wife sent him a message: "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." Pilate hesitated. He saw no guilt in Jesus deserving death. Luke records him saying, "I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will punish him and then release him." But the shouts grew more urgent. The fear of a riot, something that could jeopardize his position in Rome, began to outweigh his reluctance. The more he resisted, the more forcefully the crowd demanded Jesus' execution. The exchange. At last, Pilate gave the order. Barabbas would be released. Jesus would be handed over to be crucified. The Gospels present this as the great irony of the Passion narrative. The innocent is condemned, and the guilty walks free. Barabbas, shackles removed, stepped out into the sunlight a free man. Did he glance at Jesus? Did he feel gratitude, shame, or perhaps vindication, believing Rome had once again failed to crush the spirit of rebellion? The Scriptures do not say. For Jesus, the path led to Golgotha. For Barabbas, it led back into the shadows of history. Theological implication. For Christian theologians, the moment is heavy with symbolism. Barabbas represents humanity, guilty, deserving judgment, yet spared because the innocent takes our place. In this view, Barabbas is not merely a historical figure, but a stand-in for all who are forgiven and set free through Christ's sacrifice. Early church fathers, such as Origen and Chrysostom, reflected on this, noting that the choice between Jesus and Barabbas mirrors the choices every person faces: the way of the kingdom of God or the way of worldly rebellion. Historical questions. From a historical critical perspective, the story raises questions. Was there truly such a Passover amnesty? Some scholars argue there is no direct evidence for it outside the Gospels, while others suggest Rome may have allowed occasional gestures of leniency to pacify subject peoples. The portrayal of the crowd also invites debate. Were they ordinary citizens swayed by the leaders, or was the gathering a staged assembly of those loyal to the temple authorities? The Gospels emphasize the influence of the priests, but the political pressures on Pilate are undeniable. Barabbas in later traditions, later Christian literature, apocryphal texts, and even medieval plays gave Barabbas different personalities. Sometimes a hardened killer, sometimes a misunderstood patriot. In some retellings, he is even converted after hearing of Jesus' resurrection. In others, he remains defiant, a symbol of worldly rebellion that refuses redemption. The ambiguity of his fate keeps the figure of Barabbas alive in theological and literary imagination. In the next part, we'll follow the afterlife of Barabbas' story, how his image evolved in theology, art, literature, and modern reinterpretations, and explore why this shadowy figure continues to fascinate across centuries. The shadows of justice, Barabbas and the crowd. The morning sun over Jerusalem had risen higher now, bathing the city walls in gold and shadow. The city, still thick with the throngs gathered for the Passover, pulsed with expectation. For days the whispers had been building, rumors of a Galilean miracle worker, a prophet, perhaps even the long-awaited Messiah, standing trial before the Roman governor. The courtyard outside the praetorium was already filling, a restless, uneasy crowd swaying between curiosity and a strange, feverish anticipation. But beneath this public drama, another story was quietly unfolding. The fate of a man known to almost every inhabitant of Jerusalem, though for very different reasons. His name was Barabbas. To some, he was a patriot, a man who had fought against the iron hand of Rome, who had taken up arms in defense of his people's dignity. To others, he was a dangerous criminal, a man with blood on his hands, whose zeal had crossed into the chaos of murder. And to the Romans, he was simply a rebel and a threat, the kind of man they had crucified by the hundreds on the roadways leading to the city. Yet on this morning, the lives of Barabbas and the Galilean known as Jesus of Nazareth would collide in a way neither could have foreseen: the Roman custom and Pilate's calculus. Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect of Judea, was no stranger to political games. The Passover was always a tense time for the Romans. The city swelled with pilgrims, nationalistic fervor ran high, and every street corner was a potential spark for rebellion. Roman soldiers patrolled with spears in hand, eyes scanning for signs of unrest. There was a local custom, or so the Gospels tell us, for the governor to release one prisoner to the crowd during Passover, a gesture meant to appease Jewish sentiment and display Roman magnanimity. Whether this tradition was an established ritual or a political improvisation is debated among scholars. Some historians argue that such a release was a tool in the prefect's arsenal to curry favor and reduce unrest. Others question whether it was ever a true custom at all, suggesting it may have been an ad hoc political maneuver, remembered and preserved in the gospel narrative because of its symbolic power. Pilate, faced with the dilemma of what to do with Jesus, a man the Sanhedrin accused of blasphemy, but whose guilt under Roman law was far from certain, saw an opportunity. He could offer the crowd a choice: the notorious rebel Barabbas, guilty of violence and insurrection, or Jesus, the unarmed preacher whose only crime seemed to be challenging the religious authorities. It was, in Pilate's mind, a political sleight of hand. Surely the crowd would choose the harmless Galilean over a known murderer. It would spare Pilate from condemning a man he found no fault in, while also allowing him to sidestep the wrath of the priests who demanded Jesus' death. But politics rarely move in the straight lines their architects imagine. The crowd, fickle or engineered. Here lies one of the most haunting questions in the Barabbas episode. Who exactly was in that crowd? The city was vast, its population swelling to hundreds of thousands during Passover. The majority of Jesus' followers were likely nowhere near the praetorium that morning. Many would have been scattered throughout the city, preparing for the festival. The crowd before Pilate was likely composed not of a random cross-section of Jerusalem's people, but of those stirred, summoned, or influenced by the temple authorities. The Gospels describe a disturbing shift. When Pilate offers the choice between Jesus and Barabbas, the crowd calls for Barabbas. The priests, according to Mark's account, actively incited them to make this choice. Was this an orchestrated moment? Many scholars believe so. The priestly elite saw Jesus as a dangerous disruptor, not because he posed a direct military threat like Barabbas, but because his teachings undermined their religious authority and stirred the masses with talk of a kingdom not ruled by Rome or the temple hierarchy. If Jesus lived, his movement might grow beyond their ability to control. And so the choice was framed in a way that ensured the outcome. Barabbas, though violent, could be contained. His rebellion, already crushed, was a known quantity. But Jesus, his influence was unpredictable, his movement still gathering momentum. Better to have Rome kill him now, before his message became an unstoppable tide. Barabbas, a man between death and life. Inside his cell, Barabbas may have known nothing of these political maneuvers. Shackled, perhaps bruised from interrogation, he would have been expecting crucifixion, the standard Roman punishment for insurrectionists and murderers. He would have known what that meant. A public, agonizing death, his body left on a cross to rot in the sun as a warning to others. And then the unimaginable happened. A guard's voice, the rattle of a key, the clink of chains being unlocked, his name being shouted, but not for condemnation, for release. It is difficult to imagine what must have passed through his mind in that moment. Confusion, disbelief, perhaps even defiance, suspecting some cruel Roman trick. But then he stepped into the open air, squinting against the daylight, and saw the mob, saw the man in chains beside Pilate, the one they called Jesus. Did their eyes meet? The Gospels do not say, but the human mind can hardly resist imagining it. Barabbas the guilty and Jesus the innocent, locked in a brief, silent exchange as the machinery of politics and power ground on around them. The theological weight of the exchange. For Christians through the centuries, the Barabbas episode has been more than a historical curiosity. It has become a profound theological symbol. In the eyes of many early theologians, Barabbas stands as a metaphor for all humanity. Guilty, condemned, deserving of death, and yet released because the innocent one took his place. Origen of Alexandria saw in Barabbas a mirror of the sinner set free, his life purchased by the sacrifice of Christ. Augustine of Hippo reflected on the irony that the Son of the Father, for that is what the name Barabbas literally means in Aramaic, was freed while the true Son of the Father was condemned. The substitution is central to the Christian understanding of atonement. Jesus dies not because he is guilty, but so that the guilty might live. Whether one views this through the lens of substitutionary atonement, moral influence theory, or other theological models, the image of Barabbas walking free while Jesus is led to the cross has echoed in sermons and meditations for nearly 2,000 years. Barabbas in the historical imagination. Outside of theological reflection, Barabbas has fascinated historians, novelists, and filmmakers alike. In some retellings, he is portrayed as a revolutionary hero, a man driven by fierce love for his people but twisted by violence. In others, he is little more than a brute, a killer with no redeeming qualities. Still others imagine his life after release. Did he return to his old ways, or was he haunted by the man who died in his place? The Swedish novelist Per Lagerkvist, in his 1950 work Barabbas, imagined him as a man forever burdened by the mysterious figure who had been crucified instead of him. Lagerkvist's Barabbas wanders, searching for meaning, unable to escape the shadow of the Nazarene. The story, later adapted into a film starring Anthony Quinn, captured the enduring human fascination with what might have become of this man whose life was spared in such extraordinary circumstances. An ending that begins a story. The choice made that morning in Jerusalem reverberates far beyond its moment in time. The crowd's cry, Barabbas, has been interpreted as the voice of humanity itself, choosing the familiar sins of power, violence, and rebellion over the unsettling purity of truth and mercy. And yet, it is also the voice that secures the central act of Christian salvation. Without the rejection of Jesus, there is no cross, and without the cross, no resurrection. So, among the host of exiles, there is no alien God in resurrection. For Barabbas himself, the day must have felt like the narrowest escape possible. A breath's distance from death, a second chance handed to him without merit. Whether he understood its cost, whether he even cared, is unknown. History lets him vanish into silence. But for the believer, his shadow remains on the page, the guilty man walking free while the innocent is condemned. And perhaps that is why his name, though mentioned only briefly in the Gospels, has not faded from memory. In the strange, unsettling exchange between Jesus and Barabbas, we see not only a moment of ancient history, but a mirror held up to the human soul. The trial before Pilate and the choice of the crowd. The morning light over Jerusalem was thin and pale, still stretching its fingers through the high walls of the city when the prisoner exchange tradition unfolded, a tradition that would forever place the name Barabbas in the annals of theological debate and moral reflection. It was the time of Pesach, the great feast of Passover, when the city swelled with pilgrims from every corner of Judea and beyond. The streets were crowded with merchants, priests, travelers, and Roman soldiers keeping watch over the restless population. And in the heart of the city, at the Praetorium, the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, sat upon the tribunal seat, prepared to enact a custom meant to appease the Jewish people, the release of one prisoner of their choosing. Pilate was no fool. His years in Judea had taught him that tensions ran high during Passover. The festival commemorated Israel's liberation from Egypt, and with that memory came the dangerous longing for freedom from Rome. If there was one week when sedition could boil over into riot, it was this one. The prisoner release was a calculated act of politics, a concession to the masses to keep their passions from igniting into open rebellion. Among the prisoners awaiting judgment, two figures stood in stark contrast. One was Jesus of Nazareth, brought before Pilate by the temple authorities on charges of blasphemy and sedition, accusations designed to cloak religious animosity and political threat. The other was Barabbas, a man whose notoriety had already spread through the streets. The Gospels are unambiguous in their depiction of Barabbas as a violent figure. Mark 15 calls him a rebel involved in an insurrection, guilty of murder during an uprising. Luke 23:19 echoes the charge, adding that he had been imprisoned for a certain sedition made in the city and for murder. Matthew 20:16 labels him simply as a notorious prisoner. John's Gospel 18:40 calls him a lestis, a word that in Greek can mean bandit, but was also used to describe zealot freedom fighters, political insurgents against Rome. This is a key nuance. To the Romans, Barabbas was a criminal and a threat to order. To certain factions among the Jewish population, he may have been a folk hero, a man who dared to raise his hand against the imperial oppressor. The difference in perception would prove crucial. Pilate, faced with what he considered a relatively harmless preacher from Galilee and a dangerous insurgent, must have expected the crowd to demand Jesus' release. It was the logical choice from the perspective of public safety. The governor even attempted to leverage this expectation. "Whom do you want me to release to you?" Pilate asked, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" But in the gathered multitude, voices stirred and rose in a chant that seemed to gather force like a wave crashing upon the shore. It was the chief priests and elders who moved among the people, whispering, persuading, urging them toward a choice Pilate had not foreseen. "Barabbas," they cried. Pilate hesitated. "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" "Crucify him," came the response, raw and unrelenting. The scene, as the Gospels record it, carries an almost theatrical tension. Here is a Roman official, pragmatic and politically calculating, trying to placate both the crowd and his sense of justice. Here is a mob, swayed by religious leaders who saw Jesus as a dangerous disruptor of their own authority. And here is Barabbas, silent in the records, his thoughts unknown, standing on the threshold of an unexpected freedom. Scholars have long debated the nature of this Passover amnesty tradition. No Roman records outside the Gospels confirm such a custom, though amnesties were not unheard of in the empire. Some suggest it was a uniquely local concession. Others see it as a narrative device, emphasizing the theological point that the innocent is condemned while the guilty goes free. Whatever the historical particulars, the symbolic weight is immense. In this moment, Barabbas becomes more than a man. He becomes a mirror held up to humanity. The choice between Jesus and Barabbas is not just the choice of an ancient crowd. It is the choice between two visions of salvation, one through the sword, the other through sacrifice. When Pilate finally yields, washing his hands in a public gesture of disassociation, Barabbas is released. One can imagine him stepping into the sunlight, the chains falling away, perhaps hearing the distant hammering that would soon echo from Golgotha. He walks free, his crimes unpunished, because another man, one without crime, takes his place on the cross. The theological implications here are profound. In Christian interpretation, Barabbas becomes an archetype for the sinner. He stands guilty under the law, yet is released because the innocent takes his punishment. In this way, the story foreshadows the substitutionary nature of the crucifixion itself. Early church fathers like Origen and Augustine would draw on this parallel, seeing in Barabbas a representation of all humanity, spared from judgment by the sacrifice of Christ. But outside the theological frame, one can still see in this exchange a portrait of the volatile intersection of politics, religion, and public opinion. Pilate's decision is not born of conviction, but of expedience. The crowd's choice may be shaped by nationalist fervor, fear of Roman reprisal, or simple manipulation by those in power. And Barabbas himself, whatever his later fate, steps back into a world where the forces that condemned one man and freed another remain deeply unchanged. It is here that Barabbas' historical reality fades again into silence. The Gospels say nothing more of him after his release. Did he return to his comrades in the insurrection? Did the reprieve awaken in him any reflection or change? Or did he vanish into the shadows of the city, another man whose name would be remembered only because of the one with whom he was briefly compared? The choice between Barabbas and Jesus remains one of the most striking moral moments in the New Testament. It is a scene where political manipulation, human fear, divine purpose, and public will converge, and where a man condemned for bloodshed walks away free, while the one accused of peace is nailed to a cross. The trial of two men, Jesus and Barabbas. The early morning air in Jerusalem was tense, charged with the energy of a crowd gathering for a spectacle. The sun had barely risen, yet the streets near the Antonia fortress already echoed with murmurs, footsteps, and the occasional shout. Pilgrims from all over Judea and beyond filled the city, but this morning was different. There was a trial, and not just any trial, but one that would decide the fate of two men whose names would echo through history. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, stood at the center of it all, but even he did not fully command the situation. He had been appointed to maintain peace, to ensure that Rome's authority was respected, and to handle sensitive political cases swiftly. But in this case, the pressure was heavier than usual. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, had brought before him a prisoner named Jesus of Nazareth, accusing him of blasphemy and sedition. Normally, religious disputes were not Pilate's concern, but the council had framed the charges as a threat to Roman order. This Jesus claimed to be a king. Pilate was skeptical. He had dealt with rebels before, and they were usually loud, angry, and openly defiant. This man, however, seemed calm, almost detached, as though the accusations could not touch him. Pilate questioned him, and Jesus spoke of a kingdom not of this world. The governor found no threat in him, at least not the kind that Rome feared. But Pilate was not naive. He knew that the Sanhedrin wanted this man gone, and they were willing to stir unrest if they didn't get their way. Then came the opportunity for a political maneuver. The Passover pardon tradition. A peculiar local custom had developed over the years, blending Roman authority with Jewish tradition. During Passover, the governor would release one prisoner chosen by the crowd, a symbolic gesture of mercy, perhaps intended to honor the Jewish celebration of deliverance from Egypt. No official Roman law mandated it, but it was politically expedient. It gave the people a sense of participation, a momentary taste of power over their occupiers. This year, Pilate saw a chance to use that tradition to his advantage. He would present the crowd with a choice between Jesus of Nazareth and another prisoner, someone whose crimes were obvious, whose guilt was beyond doubt. Surely the crowd would choose the man who had healed the sick and preached peace over a violent rebel. The other prisoner's name was Barabbas. Barabbas in chains. Barabbas was no petty thief. The Gospels describe him as a man involved in insurrection and murder. Mark 15:7, Luke 23:19. The Greek word used, lestis, often referred not just to robbers, but to political bandits, the kind who waged guerrilla attacks against Roman forces and their collaborators. To the Romans, Barabbas was a criminal and a terrorist. To some Jews, however, he might have been a freedom fighter, one willing to shed blood for Israel's liberation. On that morning, Barabbas stood in the shadows of the prison yard, his wrists and ankles bound in heavy iron. His face was weathered, his hair unkempt, his clothes torn. He had killed for his cause, perhaps in an ambush or a riot. His name, Barabbas, literally meant son of the father in Aramaic, a striking coincidence considering that Jesus, too, claimed a unique relationship with the Father. Barabbas did not expect mercy. Roman justice was swift and brutal. Rebels were crucified as a public warning. He had likely resigned himself to the same fate. The crowd's choice. Pilate had them both brought before the crowd. Two men stood side by side. One, a rabbi with a following, accused of blasphemy and vague political ambition. The other, a convicted murderer and insurrectionist. Pilate addressed the people, "Whom do you want me to release to you? Jesus, called the Messiah, or Barabbas?" It seemed an obvious choice to the governor, but the crowd's reaction surprised him. The chief priests and elders, moving through the gathering like seasoned politicians, whispered and persuaded. They stirred resentment, accusing Jesus of misleading the nation, of dishonoring the temple. Barabbas, they suggested, had at least fought for Israel. When Pilate repeated the question, the answer came in a roar. Barabbas! The governor blinked. Perhaps he had misheard. He tried again. Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah? The chant rose louder, harsher. Crucify him! The puzzling outcome. From a purely rational standpoint, the choice made little sense. Jesus had healed, taught, and forgave. Barabbas had killed. Yet the crowd, fueled by political manipulation, fear, and perhaps disappointment that Jesus had not led a revolt against Rome, chose the man of violence over the man of peace. Pilate, sensing the potential for riot, reluctantly granted their wish. He ceremonially washed his hands before them, declaring himself innocent of the blood of this just man. It was a gesture more symbolic than sincere. In truth, Roman authority still bore the responsibility. But the decision was made. Barabbas was unshackled. The weight of the chains fell from his wrists, and he stepped into the daylight as a free man. Jesus, meanwhile, was led away to be flogged and crucified. Barabbas' perspective. The Gospels do not record Barabbas' thoughts. Did he feel gratitude, guilt, indifference? One can imagine the shock of sudden liberation, the disorienting rush from the darkness of a cell to the blinding sun, from the certainty of death to the bewildering gift of life. Perhaps he had heard of Jesus. Perhaps he even knew that this man was innocent, and perhaps, as the crowd roared for crucifixion, he realized that his freedom had been purchased at the cost of another's life. We cannot know if Barabbas changed after that day. Some traditions imagine him returning to his old ways, unrepentant. Others speculate that he became a follower of the very man who died in his place. History is silent. But the symbolism is inescapable. The guilty one freed, the innocent one condemned. Theological echoes. For early Christians, the Barabbas episode was more than a historical footnote. It became a vivid illustration of substitution. The heart of the gospel message. Barabbas stood as a representative of all humanity, guilty, deserving punishment, yet set free because another bore the penalty. Origen, the 3rd century theologian, wrote that we are all Barabbas in a spiritual sense. We are the rebels, the lawbreakers, the ones who should stand condemned. But Jesus takes our place, bearing the sentence so that we might go free. The irony deepens when we remember Barabbas's name, Son of the Father. The crowd chose the wrong Son of the Father to release, rejecting the true Son of the Heavenly Father. Yet in God's providence, even this rejection fulfilled the plan of redemption. Political realities and human nature. The choice between Jesus and Barabbas reveals uncomfortable truths about politics and human nature. The crowd was not merely choosing between two men, they were choosing between two visions of salvation. Barabbas represented the immediate, tangible, and violent struggle for liberation. His way was the sword, swift action against the enemy. Jesus offered a slower, inward transformation of the heart, a kingdom not of this world. To a people under occupation, the latter might have seemed impractical, even naive. It is not hard to see why the crowd's choice was swayed. Fear, propaganda, and the promise of decisive action often overpower quieter calls for peace and moral renewal. History repeats this pattern again and again. The people choose the warrior over the healer, the militant over the reconciler. The aftermath. By mid-morning, Barabbas was gone from the records. The Gospels shift their focus entirely to Jesus' path to Golgotha. In a way, that is fitting. Barabbas' story is not about him alone, but about the one who died instead of him. Yet one cannot help but imagine his steps that day. Did he watch from a distance as Roman soldiers led Jesus away? Did he hear the hammering of nails and the cries from the cross? Did he feel the weight of the trade, his life for another's? In that unspoken space, the story of Barabbas becomes deeply personal. It invites every listener to ask, if I had been in his place, what would I have done? And the answer to that question might shape the way we understand mercy, justice, and sacrifice. The shadow of the cross. The sun had climbed high above Jerusalem, drenching the city in a glaring, merciless light. By now the Roman guards had finished their grim duty. 2 crosses already stood on the hill outside the city walls, each bearing a man condemned for crimes against Rome. The air around Golgotha was heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid tang of sweat and dust. Crows circled overhead, their cries sharp and impatient, as if they too were awaiting the inevitable. And yet, one cross still lay upon the ground, unused. It was his cross. Barabbas stood in the marketplace, half hidden in the shadow of a date palm, watching from a distance. He could not shake the image from his mind, the rough-hewn timber, the iron nails, the mocking laughter of the soldiers. Every detail was burned into him, not from experience, but from knowledge. He should have been there. The wood should have torn into his shoulders. The nails should have pierced his hands. Every heartbeat he felt now was one that had been purchased with the life of another man. At first he told himself that this was simply fortune. Many men in Jerusalem would have called it a miracle, an act of divine favor. Had not the crowd demanded his release? Had not the Roman governor himself yielded to their cries? Surely this was destiny. Surely the gods, or the God of Israel, had chosen to spare him. But as the hours passed, a different thought began to worm its way into his heart. What if it wasn't for him? The first whispers of doubt. Barabbas had no illusions about who he was. He had spilled blood in the streets, robbed Roman caravans, and plotted uprisings with men who dreamed of revolt but cared little for the cost in human lives. He was no innocent. In the eyes of both Rome and the temple priests, his fate had been just, and yet a man who spoke of peace, who healed the sick and comforted the poor, had been nailed to the beams meant for him. The irony was almost unbearable. He tried to shove the thought away, but it clung to him. He wandered through the city's back alleys, listening to the whispers that passed from mouth to mouth. People spoke of signs in the sky, of the temple veil tearing from top to bottom, of an unnatural darkness that had swallowed the land at midday. Some said the earth itself had trembled, and others claimed that even the hardened Roman centurion who oversaw the execution had declared, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Barabbas did not know what to make of it. Was it superstition? Madness? Or was there something more? He thought of the man's face, calm even as the crowd roared for his death, his eyes strangely steady when Pilate offered the choice. Barabbas remembered the brief moment when their gazes had met. He had expected to see hatred. Instead, he had seen something unsettling: pity. A city divided. Jerusalem after the crucifixion was a city torn in two. On one side were those who celebrated the death of a dangerous agitator, convinced that the temple was safer without him. On the other side were his followers, scattered and afraid, whispering in hidden rooms. The Romans cared little for either camp. To them, it was just another day in a troublesome province. But the name of Jesus would not fade. Barabbas found himself in the company of men who laughed at the Galileans' followers. They mocked their tears, called them dreamers clinging to the memory of a failed prophet. "He's dead," one man spat, "and so is his cause. Rome wins. Rome always wins." The others nodded in agreement, raising cups of wine to seal the thought. Yet Barabbas could not drink with them. Something in him recoiled from their laughter. Rome had won, yes, but the victory felt hollow. The man they had crucified had not fought, had not begged, had not cursed, and somehow that made the whole affair feel less like a defeat and more like a mystery. The rumors of the third day. 2 days passed. On the morning of the third, the city awoke to a new wave of whispers. The tomb was empty. The Roman guards, those same hardened soldiers who had nailed the man to the cross, were in chaos, some claiming they had been overpowered, others speaking in hushed voices of a blinding light and a figure they could not look upon. His followers were saying he had risen from the dead. Barabbas scoffed at first. The dead did not rise. Bodies did not walk once nailed to a cross. And yet, he remembered the stories of the prophets. Elijah had raised the widow's son. Elisha had brought a child back to life. Even in the Roman world, there were tales of gods who returned from the underworld. What if, just what if, this man was more than a teacher? The thought was both terrifying and intoxicating. The weight of the exchange. For the first time in years, Barabbas left the safety of the city and walked toward the place of the skull. The hill was quiet now, the crosses gone, the ground stained with dark patches that the rain had not yet washed away. He stood where the center cross had been, his boots sinking slightly into the churned earth. He tried to picture himself here, nailed and hanging, the life draining from him. The image was too vivid. His chest tightened. His breath grew short. And then came the other image, the one that would not leave him, of the man who had taken his place, a man who had said nothing in his defense, a man who had walked willingly into the jaws of death. Barabbas had never feared dying, but this was something worse, the unbearable burden of a life spared. If this Jesus had indeed risen, what did that mean for him? Was his freedom a gift or a debt? And if it was a debt, how was he to repay it? Seeds of change. In the weeks that followed, Barabbas drifted through Jerusalem like a man caught between two worlds. He avoided the zealot gatherings, avoided the taverns, avoided the old haunts where his name still carried weight. Instead, he found himself lingering on the edges of the groups who followed the risen teacher. He listened to their testimonies, heard them speak of forgiveness, of love for enemies, of a kingdom not built by human hands. It was a message that clashed violently with everything he had lived for, and yet something deep within him began to stir, something he had not felt since he was a boy. How Barabbas' story fades from the pages of history after this point. The Gospels tell us nothing of what became of him. Perhaps he returned to his old life, the pull of violence too strong to resist. Perhaps he vanished into the hills, a fugitive once more. Or perhaps, and this is the version the heart longs to believe, he became one of those nameless men who followed the way of the crucified and risen Christ, quietly carrying the weight of that great exchange for the rest of his days. Either way, one fact remains unshakable. On that Passover morning, the fate of a murderer and the fate of the Son of God crossed paths, and history itself bent under the weight of that moment. For the man called Barabbas, every breath thereafter was a borrowed one. Barabbas after the crowd's choice, shadows beyond the cross. The choice had been made. The crowd, whipped into frenzy by the priests and the temple authorities, had shouted until their voices were hoarse, "Release Barabbas!" It had been a moment of raw human emotion, anger, resentment, and perhaps an undercurrent of fear, all intertwined into a single decisive cry. Pilate had washed his hands in a symbolic gesture, but it was clear to everyone that the decision lay on the people's shoulders. Jesus would be crucified, Barabbas would be free. But freedom, when it came, was strange. A man out of place in his own story. The Gospel writers never tell us what Barabbas did after he stepped out of the fortress of Antonia. Did he slip into the crowd, vanish into the labyrinth of Jerusalem's streets and try to blend in? Did he watch from a distance as the man who had taken his place carried a cross to Golgotha? Or did he simply flee the city entirely, seeking refuge from Roman watchmen who might one day decide that releasing him was a mistake? Some traditions imagine Barabbas as stunned, even confused. He had expected death that morning. Roman crucifixion was not a punishment one escaped. The cross was final, humiliating, and public. Men condemned to it were stripped of their dignity and displayed as a warning. Barabbas had likely made peace with the idea that he would die in agony, lungs burning, body nailed to wood. And yet suddenly he was free, walking under the bright Judean sun with the scent of Passover lambs roasting in the air. Freedom could feel like disorientation, a shadow at the crucifixion. There is a haunting speculation among some theologians and storytellers. What if Barabbas, compelled by curiosity or something deeper, followed the procession to Golgotha? From a hilltop or behind the press of onlookers, perhaps he saw the man who had taken his place nailed to the wood that should have been his. The placard above Jesus' head would have read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," a political charge, just as Barabbas had been. Early Christian writers saw symbolism here: Barabbas the guilty set free, Jesus the innocent executed. It was more than an exchange of fates, it was a living parable. Whether Barabbas understood it or not, his life had become an illustration of substitutionary sacrifice. If Barabbas was there, watching, he might have noticed the crowd's mood shift as the hours passed. Some mocked, others wept. Roman soldiers gambled for garments, and when darkness covered the land, perhaps Barabbas felt a chill, not just from the sudden absence of light, but from the thought that his own life now carried a debt he could never repay. Political fallout. The authorities' decision to release Barabbas was not without risk. The zealot movements of the first century were unpredictable, and leaders like Barabbas, whether charismatic or ruthless, could stir unrest again. Rome's tolerance for sedition was zero. If Barabbas rejoined his fellow rebels, the result could be more bloodshed and harsher crackdowns. Historical patterns suggest that Rome often rearrested troublemakers within months, sometimes weeks, of their release. Whether Barabbas avoided such a fate is unknown. No surviving Roman record names him after this event, though given the low priority of rebel foot soldiers in imperial archives, that is hardly surprising. Still, his survival in memory owes everything to the fact that his story intersected with Jesus's. Barabbas in later legends. Over centuries, Christian imagination expanded on Barabbas's fate. Some apocryphal accounts portray him as repentant, seeking out the apostles after hearing of the resurrection. In these versions, Barabbas becomes a follower of the Way, dedicating his second chance at life to the service of the gospel. The Acts of Pilate, a late text of uncertain reliability, hints at Barabbas's awareness of the miracle of his release, though it offers no details. Other traditions take a darker turn. Some storytellers imagine Barabbas sinking back into violence, his reprieve wasted on further bloodshed. In these retellings, he dies as he lived, by the sword, perhaps in some skirmish with Roman patrols, forgotten by history except for the day he was spared. Both versions carry moral weight. In the first, Barabbas becomes a living testimony to grace. In the second, a warning that mercy, if unreceived, changes nothing. Theological symbolism, Barabbas as every man. Church fathers like Origen and Augustine drew on Barabbas' story to illustrate the human condition. In their view, Barabbas is not just a man in history, he is humanity itself. All stand guilty before divine justice, yet all are offered release because another takes their place. This interpretation deepens when one considers Barabbas' name. In Aramaic, Barabba means son of the Father. Some manuscripts of Matthew even give his full name as Jesus Barabbas. Jesus, son of the Father. The irony is sharp. The crowd was asked to choose between two men called Son of the Father. One was a violent rebel. The other, Christians believe, was the true Son of God. The crowd chose the rebel. The choice, early theologians suggested, mirrors the choices people make in every generation, between the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of this world, between the cross and the sword. Echoes in art and literature. From medieval mystery plays to modern novels, Barabbas has appeared as a figure of unsettling power. Pär Lagerquist's 1950 novel Barabbas, for example, imagines him wandering through a world forever marked by the man who died in his place. In Lagerquist's telling, Barabbas is haunted, unable to fully believe, yet unable to forget. Painters, too, have been drawn to the scene of Pilate presenting Jesus and Barabbas to the crowd. Often the two stand side by side, the contrast stark. The ragged zealot, chains still clinking, and the calm Nazarene, bloodied but unbowed. The choice, in visual form, forces the viewer into the crowd's position. Whom would you choose? Barabbas in historical critical studies. Modern scholars examine Barabbas through the lenses of textual criticism and socio-political history. Was he a historical person or a narrative device? The consensus leans toward his historicity. The details are too politically specific to be mere allegory. Yet the way the Gospels present him, especially the parallel between the charges against him and against Jesus, suggests deliberate theological shaping. Historian Raymond Brown notes that the Passover amnesty tradition is otherwise unattested in Roman practice, making it unique in the Gospel record. This has led some to question whether the release was historical or a narrative construction designed to underline Jesus' innocence. Others argue that local governors sometimes bent formal rules to placate volatile populations, making Pilate's action plausible in a politically charged Jerusalem. After the curtain falls. In the end, Barabbas slips back into the shadows of history. His fate, whether glorious or grim, is unknown, yet the echoes of that one moment when a crowd chose him over Jesus reverberate through theology, literature, and art. For some, Barabbas remains a historical curiosity, a footnote in the Passion narrative. For others, he is a mirror, reflecting humanity's constant struggle between redemption and rebellion. And for those who ponder the silence after his release, there is a lingering question. What did Barabbas do with his freedom? The legacy of Barabbas, between history, theology, and imagination. Barabbas steps back into the shadows of history, but his story refuses to fade away entirely. Over the centuries, this man, whose fate was so intertwined with that of Jesus of Nazareth, has occupied a peculiar place in Christian thought, theological discourse, historical scholarship, and cultural imagination. His name is remembered not for his own deeds, but for the fateful choice made by the Jerusalem crowd: release the guilty Barabbas and condemn the innocent Jesus. Historical ambiguity and scholarly debate. First, it is important to acknowledge that outside the New Testament, Barabbas does not appear in Roman or Jewish historical records. This absence has led some scholars to question his historicity, proposing that he may be a literary creation, a symbolic figure constructed to serve the theological and moral narrative of the Gospels. However, the consensus among many historians is that Barabbas likely was a real person. The Gospel writers give him distinct details. He was imprisoned for insurrection and murder, suggesting he was a known figure to the local populace, a rebel against Roman authority. The term lestis used to describe him in John's Gospel is notable. It could mean bandit, but also referred to zealots, Jewish nationalists who engaged in violent resistance. This situates Barabbas within the volatile political milieu of first-century Judea, where numerous factions vied against Roman occupation. Raymond E. Brown, a renowned biblical scholar, points out that Pilate's practice of releasing a prisoner at Passover has no clear parallels in Roman law, but may reflect a localized tradition or a pragmatic political move by a governor keen to maintain peace during a volatile festival. Thus, Barabbas stands at the crossroads of history and narrative art, a man whose real-life rebellion likely intersected with the charged religious and political tensions that defined Jerusalem in the first century. Barabbas as a theological symbol. Theologically, Barabbas assumes an outsized role far beyond that of a mere prisoner. Early Christian writers such as Origen and Augustine interpreted him as a symbolic figure representing sinful humanity. Just as Barabbas was guilty and deserving punishment but was released in place of Jesus, so too all people are sinners who receive mercy because Christ bore the penalty for sin. Moreover, the very meaning of his name, Barabbas, Aramaic for Son of the Father, is laden with irony and theological depth. Some manuscripts of Matthew's Gospel even name him Jesus Barabbas, underscoring a stark contrast between two sons of the Father, one a rebel and murderer, the other the incarnate Son of God. The crowd's choice between these two figures becomes a profound metaphor for humanity's choice between rebellion and redemption. This juxtaposition powerfully illustrates the Christian doctrine of substitutionary atonement. Jesus dies not for himself, but in place of sinners. The crowd's demand to free Barabbas and crucify Jesus is thus a narrative emblem of mankind's rejection of divine grace and preference for worldly rebellion. Barabbas, in art and literature. Barabbas's ambiguous figure has fascinated artists and writers for centuries. Medieval mystery plays dramatized the choice between Jesus and Barabbas, often highlighting the dramatic tension and moral implications. In Renaissance art, the presentation of Jesus and Barabbas before Pilate became a frequent motif, showing the contrast between innocence and guilt, peace and violence. In modern literature, Swedish author Per Lagerkvist's novel Barabbas, 1950, is among the most notable works exploring his character in depth. Lagerkvist imagines Barabbas struggling with the trauma of being spared while Jesus died. The novel delves into themes of faith, doubt, and redemption, portraying Barabbas as a man haunted by existential questions. This humanization has influenced how contemporary readers perceive Barabbas, not just as a historical or theological symbol, but as a complex individual caught in an extraordinary moment. Barabbas also appears in films, such as the 1961 movie Barabbas, which further expand on his psychological and spiritual journey after release. In the psychological and moral dimensions. At its core, the story of Barabbas presents a moral dilemma that resonates through the ages. How does one respond to mercy? Is freedom always a gift, or can it become a burden too heavy to bear? Barabbas was spared, but was his life changed? Did he become a better man, or did he return to violence and rebellion? The Gospels remain silent on his fate, inviting speculation. His release challenges the listener or reader to ponder forgiveness, repentance, and the human capacity for transformation. Historical aftermath and the socio-political context. The political realities of first-century Judea provide crucial background for understanding Barabbas's role. The region was rife with unrest, fueled by resentment of Roman occupation and harsh taxation. Groups like the Zealots advocated armed resistance, often resorting to guerrilla tactics and assassinations. Barabbas, as a known insurrectionist, was part of this milieu. His release, therefore, was not only a personal reprieve, but a potentially dangerous political act. Pilate's decision to release him to the crowd may have been a calculated risk, an attempt to placate Jewish leaders and prevent a larger uprising. Yet this gamble may have sown seeds of future rebellion. Within a few decades, Judea would erupt in the Jewish-Roman War, 66-73 CE, leading to the destruction of the Second Temple. Whether Barabbas himself took part in further violence is unknown, but his figure symbolizes the tension between submission and resistance that shaped that era. Textual variants and manuscript traditions. Interestingly, some ancient manuscripts differ in how they name Barabbas. In certain copies of Matthew's Gospel, his full name appears as Jesus Barabbas, adding another layer of complexity to the narrative. This variant raises questions about early Christian textual traditions and the ways scribes and communities interpreted and transmitted these stories. Was this naming an intentional juxtaposition by the author, or a later scribal addition meant to emphasize the theological contrast? Textual critics study these variations to better understand the origins and developments of the gospel texts, illustrating how Barabbas' story was central to early Christian identity formation. Barabbas as a mirror of human choice. Ultimately, Barabbas' enduring significance lies in the moral and spiritual questions his story provokes. The crowd's choice, the willing release of a convicted rebel over an innocent man, symbolizes humanity's preference for power, violence, and rebellion over humility, sacrifice, and peace. Every generation encounters this choice in different forms. The figure of Barabbas holds a mirror to the human heart, exposing the inclination to reject what is difficult and embrace what promises immediate gratification or security, even at the cost of justice. This dynamic invites reflection on personal and communal levels. How do individuals and societies choose between self-interest and sacrifice, between violence and peace? Barabbas remains one of the most intriguing figures connected to the Passion narrative, an emblem of rebellion, mercy, and human choice. Though his personal history fades into the shadows, the theological and symbolic power of his story continues to inspire reflection, artistic creation, and scholarly debate. His tale is a reminder that history is not just about kings and prophets, but also about those caught in between, the rebels and the forgiven, the lost and the redeemed. Through Barabbas, we glimpse the paradox of grace, that freedom can come to the guilty, that mercy can overturn justice, and that love can be found in the unlikeliest of exchanges. Barabbas in modern culture, theology, and reflection. The figure of Barabbas, once a mere footnote in the gospel narratives, has blossomed into a complex symbol whose relevance stretches far beyond the dusty streets of ancient Jerusalem. His story continues to captivate theologians, artists, writers, and audiences worldwide, inviting profound questions about justice, mercy, and human nature. Barabbas in literature and film. Perhaps no modern work has brought Barabbas back into the limelight more vividly than Per Lagerkvist's 1950 novel Barabbas. Lagerkvist, a Nobel Prize-winning Swedish author, explores the psychological turmoil of a man spared from death in the place of a stranger. The novel delves deep into Barabbas's existential struggles, his grappling with faith, doubt, guilt, and hope. Barabbas wanders through a world shadowed by the memory of the crucifixion. He confronts the cruelty of life, the silence of God, and the complexity of salvation. This portrayal moves beyond the biblical outline, humanizing Barabbas as a man burdened by a freedom he neither asked for nor understands. The novel was adapted into a film in 1961, starring Anthony Quinn as Barabbas. The cinematic portrayal further cemented Barabbas's place in popular imagination, visualizing his internal battles and his journey from violence to a tentative search for meaning. Barabbas and the question of justice. Barabbas's story raises profound questions about justice that resonate through time. On one level, his release appears to be an injustice, a murderer freed while an innocent man is condemned. Yet, within Christian theology, this apparent miscarriage of justice becomes the foundation of divine justice. The substitutionary atonement doctrine teaches that Jesus, though innocent, bore the punishment deserved by sinners like Barabbas. This paradox challenges human conceptions of fairness and compels believers to confront the depths of grace. Outside theological circles, Barabbas's story also provokes reflections on legal systems, mercy, and the use of power. The Roman governor's decision to offer a choice, the crowds shouting for Barabbas's freedom, and the political pressures surrounding the trial illustrate how justice can be swayed by circumstance, emotion, and authority. Symbol of human rebellion and redemption. Barabbas represents the rebellious human spirit, the desire to fight oppression, sometimes through violent means. He embodies the tension between resistance to injustice and the perpetuation of cycles of violence. His release symbolizes the potential for redemption, even for the most unlikely. It is a reminder that mercy extends to all, even those society condemns. For many, Barabbas's freedom is a metaphor for the transformative power of grace, capable of changing even the hardest heart. Theological reflections, Barabbas and the Christian journey. In Christian spirituality, Barabbas's story often serves as a mirror for personal reflection. Believers are invited to see themselves in Barabbas. Sinners offered mercy and freedom through Christ's sacrifice. This identification fosters humility, gratitude, and a commitment to live transformed lives. Barabbas becomes a symbol of hope. If such a man could be freed, so too can anyone be redeemed. Modern artistic interpretations. Artists continue to find inspiration in Barabbas' story. Paintings depict the moment Pilate offers the crowd a choice, highlighting the moral weight of that decision. Sculptures and stage plays dramatize the internal conflict between justice and mercy. In music, Barabbas' story has been set to dramatic scores and operas, evoking the emotional gravity of the Passion narratives. Barabbas and interfaith dialogue. Barabbas' story also plays a role in interfaith discussions. His character raises questions about Jewish and Christian relations, the historical context of the Gospels, and the dynamics of blame and responsibility. Scholars emphasize the importance of understanding Barabbas within the complex political and religious landscape of first-century Judea, cautioning against simplistic or accusatory readings that have historically fueled division. Barabbas in contemporary reflection. Today, Barabbas' story challenges individuals and societies to consider the meaning of mercy and justice. It confronts readers with difficult questions. How do we treat those deemed criminals or outsiders? Can forgiveness extend to all? What price are we willing to pay for peace? His story serves as a call to examine systems of power, the role of the crowd, public opinion, and the individual's responsibility within the community. Barabbas' legacy is thus not confined to ancient texts, but lives on as a dynamic narrative inviting continual reflection on justice, mercy, rebellion, and redemption. His story, born from the crossroads of history and theology, remains a potent symbol of the human condition, flawed, hopeful, and forever seeking freedom. Barabbas, the man, the symbol, and the question. Barabbas is in many ways the shadow of the Passion narrative, a figure whose name is spoken but whose story remains elusive. Yet his role is vital, a hinge upon which the fate of history, theology, and human reflection turns. He was a man condemned by Rome for insurrection and murder, a rebel in a land under occupation, caught in the violent upheavals of his time. The crowd's choice to release him and crucify Jesus of Nazareth was an act charged with political, social, and spiritual significance. It was a choice between two paths, one of rebellion and immediate earthly freedom, and one of sacrifice and eternal salvation. The historical Barabbas. Though details of Barabbas' life before and after his release are scarce, the historical context paints him as part of a volatile era in Judea, an era marked by resistance to Roman rule and deep religious fervor. His presence in the Gospel accounts offers a glimpse into the complex political tensions that surrounded Jesus' trial and execution. While history does not preserve Barabbas' fate beyond his release, his brief moment in the narrative has immortalized him in Christian tradition and beyond. The theological Barabbas. Theologically, Barabbas embodies the sinful humanity that Christianity teaches is redeemed through Jesus' sacrificial death. His name, Son of the Father, serves as a poignant contrast to Jesus, the true Son of the Heavenly Father. The substitutionary exchange, Barabbas freed while Jesus dies, captures the essence of divine grace and mercy. Early theologians, from Origen to Augustine, saw in Barabbas a mirror reflecting every believer's need for forgiveness and the profound mystery of atonement. The story challenges readers to confront the paradox of justice overturned and mercy extended. Barabbas in culture and reflection. Across centuries, artists, writers, and thinkers have grappled with Barabbas' legacy. Whether portrayed as a hardened rebel, a repentant follower, or a man haunted by freedom, Barabbas provokes reflection on human nature, justice, and redemption. His story invites us to question how we respond to mercy, how we choose between rebellion and peace, and how grace might transform even the most unlikely lives. The enduring question. Ultimately, Barabbas asks us a question that transcends history and theology. What would you do if given the choice between mercy and justice, between violence and peace? His story is a call to self-examination, a reminder that freedom is not just the absence of chains, but the presence of responsibility. It is a challenge to embrace grace, to seek transformation, and to recognize that, in the shadows of history, the human heart wrestles with the same choices as those long ago in Jerusalem. Barabbas remains a figure of mystery and meaning, a man freed by a crowd's shout, whose life was forever intertwined with the man who chose to die in his place. Through him, the story of redemption gains depth and complexity, reminding us that grace is the most unexpected gift and sometimes the heaviest burden to bear. If you wish, I can now help compile all parts into a single polished narrative, or provide additional materials such as suggested further readings, audio narration scripts, or even visuals prompts related to Barabbas. Just let me know.